Good morning, Chair Bochco and Commissioners. This morning we have a two-part presentation for you. First, Dr. Mary Metella, one of our staff environmental scientists, will give an overview of sea level rise vulnerability issues throughout Orange County, since we're meeting here this month. After that, we're fortunate to have Sean Hecht, Co-Executive Director of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at UCLA School of Law. Sean will present information about sea level rise adaptation and the role of insurance in addressing climate risks. And after Sean speaks, we'll have time for questions. So I'll hand it over to Dr. Metella.
Just a point of,
Sure.
How long is the presentation?
We have a 10-minute staff presentation and about 15 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Madeline, and I'll just launch in. Good morning, Commissioners. Next slide, please. I was told this would work, but okay. I'd like to start with some geologic context that sets the stage for understanding vulnerability in Orange County. So Orange County's northern coast, from Seal Beach to Newport Beach, is characterized by broad sandy beaches backed by low bluffs and mesas, and lowland areas that once held extensive wetlands. At Corona del Mar, the coastal plain ends and the San Joaquin Hills begin. From here to Dana Point, steep cliffs rise above sandy coves backed by rocky points. We see pocket beaches contained between the headlands along much of the Laguna Beach shoreline. South of Dana Point, the coastline consists of a high marine terrace above a ribbon of narrow, sandy shoreline. Orange County is known for its beaches, and they draw millions of visitors every year. And I just want to note that many of these beaches are currently maintained by jetties, groins, and sand nourishment projects. While much of the Orange County shoreline is heavily developed, there are pockets of unique wetland habitats in areas of Seal Beach, Bolsa Chica, the Santa Ana River mouth, and Upper Newport Bay, marked on this map here in the yellow stars. So Coastal Commission staff developed a report on statewide sea level rise vulnerability at the end of 2016 using local assessments, statewide data sets, and Coastal Commission district office staff interviews. This presentation uses information from that report, data from online sea level rise viewers, as well as some more recent vulnerability assessments completed by local governments. So for this reason, the results I present will sometimes use different sea level rise amounts and different storm scenarios, and so I'll point out some of the notable takeaways from these studies as I describe the findings. You can find details about the Commission's 2016 vulnerability synthesis on our website. It shows county-by-county snapshots. So broadly, Orange County faces significant sea level rise vulnerabilities, as you can see from this map from NOAA's Sea Level Rise Viewer, which shows impacts using a bathtub modeling approach. With 6 feet of sea level rise and daily tidal conditions, 11 square miles of Orange County will be inundated, associated with over $13 billion of property value, as reported by Climate Central's Surging Seas Risk Finder. Climate Central also reports, using NOAA's elevation data and a scenario of 6 feet of sea level rise, that over 50,000 residents and over 200 miles of roads will be vulnerable to tidal flooding in Orange County, and that number does not include areas protected by levees and other types of protection. So there are also other more sophisticated models and tools available that present sea level rise vulnerability information. The USGS Coastal Storm Modeling System, or COSMOS, version 3.0 has been completed for Southern California. And this predicts coastal flooding and bluff erosion due to both sea level rise and storms driven by climate change. It shows large contiguous areas in the northern part of Orange County susceptible to flooding with 6.6 feet of sea level rise by 2100. But it also analyzes where and how far bluffs are likely to recede with sea level rise in future storm scenarios. You can see that in the southern part of the county in the map here. So let's walk through some of the vulnerabilities identified in the local jurisdictions of the county. Start with Seal Beach. The city completed a vulnerability assessment in July of 2019. Coastal development within Seal Beach is vulnerable to long-term sea level rise hazards under multiple scenarios. Here's a map showing just 1.6 feet of sea level rise, as well as storm flooding. You can see it goes over a significant area of developed parcels. But under the 3.3 feet sea level rise scenario, daily tides are expected to cover this same area. So in other words, without adaptation, this large area of the city is expected to be permanently inundated by ocean water when sea levels rise to about 3 feet, which under the medium-high risk aversion scenario is expected in approximately 2070. So here's another view of Seal Beach using Cosmos data for the 6.6 foot sea level rise scenario. This shows storm flooding, and I just want to point out that Pacific Coast Highway is underwater in this scenario, and the wetland next to it in the Seal Beach National Wildlife Refuge is completely flooded as well. This map also indicates how sea level rise is projected to reduce sandy beach area over time. The vulnerability assessment found a loss of 38 acres of beach under 6.6 feet of sea level rise. So moving south to Huntington Beach, the Huntington Beach 2014 sea level rise vulnerability assessment's key findings showed that the Pacific Coast Highway and some buildings in the Huntington Harbor area are vulnerable with 1 foot or less of sea level rise. And there are significant impacts to all assets when 2 feet to 5.5 feet of sea level rise occurs. For example, wastewater collection systems will be vulnerable to 2 feet of sea level rise flooding. In the Bolsa Chica area, down coast, the Pacific Coast Highway is at high risk under 2 feet of sea level rise. Other significant impacts are likely under 5.5 feet of sea level rise, including inundation of the Huntington Beach wetlands. So some Huntington Beach areas already flood during high tides. This image here shows a king tide impacting the Sunset Beach area of Huntington Beach in 2012. King tides occur when the orbits and alignments of the Earth, Moon, and Sun combine to produce the greatest tidal effects of the year. So tidal flooding today at king tides are a preview of what higher sea levels will mean for everyday tides. Not only will developed areas be impacted by higher tides of the future, beach loss will also occur. We see this in an image of the beach at Bolsa Chica, State Beach Inlet, under low tide conditions at the top of the slide, and it's underwater at the high king tide on December 23rd of last year at the bottom of the slide there, you can see. Moving down coast, the city of Newport Beach is vulnerable to sea level rise as parts of the city already experience flooding. Areas around Newport Harbor and Newport Bay are known to experience flooding of streets and walkways around the Balboa Peninsula, Balboa Island, and other parts of Newport Beach when high water levels occur, even though much of the shoreline in these areas is armored. As you can see, under this scenario of 6.6 feet of sea level rise without storms, much of the Newport Harbor and Newport Bay area is expected to be inundated. Another aspect of sea level rise impacts in Newport Beach is on harbor infrastructure and things like bridges. We see here how at high tide, under current sea levels, some boats are not able to pass under the Newport Island Bridge. This is in 2012. Moving on to Laguna Beach, this image shows how the beaches at some coves are impacted by extreme high tides today. The city of Laguna Beach also has a low-lying downtown region which may be vulnerable to rising sea levels. In these slides representing Dana Point, you can see in the January king tides project photos here, waves at higher tides have eroded some beach area, and future losses of recreational areas are expected to occur with rising sea levels. San Clemente finished a draft vulnerability assessment for public review this summer. The primary vulnerabilities in San Clemente include increased shore and beach erosion, wave flooding, and tidal inundation. Sea level rise in San Clemente first threatens the public beach and railroad infrastructure. Here's a sample map that shows a projection of where the shoreline and bluff top will be under 4.9 feet of sea level rise. I want to point out here that the Los Angeles to San Diego Lausanne rail corridor follows an alignment along the toe of the coastal bluff and is protected by a revetment in many locations. You don't see the revetments here in this slide. But note that the current location of the railroad on this slide representing current times is seaward of what the shoreline will be under 4.9 feet of sea level rise. So here's an image of the rail corridor in the north reach of San Clemente. The effects of sea level rise on the coastal assets in the city will largely depend on the condition of the revetment lining the railroad corridor, and in the future, how the Lausanne Railroad Corridor Agency, staffed by the Orange County Transportation Authority, adapts to the existing and future coastal hazards. So this brief overview of some of Orange County's vulnerable coastal areas indicates the need for further vulnerability assessment work, as well as the importance of adaptation planning to address these identified vulnerabilities. So the Coastal Commission, along with the Coastal Conservancy and the Ocean Protection Council, have been supporting local government efforts to complete sea level rise vulnerability assessments, begin to plan adaptation strategies, and update their LCPs. We are now in the 6th year of the LCP Local Assistance Grant Program, and we have awarded almost $6 million to 37 jurisdictions throughout the state. Currently, 32 vulnerability assessments have been completed or are in progress through this grant program. The 6th round of our grant program to support this type of work had applications due last week. Sea level rise planning is continuing in Orange County, including in Seal Beach, Huntington Beach, Newport Beach, Dana Point, and San Clemente. All are working on LCP updates that include sea level rise work. In addition, Caltrans completed a draft vulnerability assessment for their District 7, which includes Orange County. Caltrans awarded the Orange County Transportation Authority an SB1 grant to identify strategies to evaluate the effects of climate change and sea level rise on the OCTA-owned rail right-of-way in Orange County and develop resilient strategies to protect those assets. So local and regional adaptation planning efforts will be critical for ensuring our coastal communities can be resilient to sea level rise in the coming years. And so this concludes our overview of Orange County sea level rise vulnerabilities.
Thanks so much, Dr. Metella. Now I'd like to introduce Sean Hecht. Sean co-directs the activities of UCLA Law's Emmett Institute, teaches law students, and also works with students to serve environmental organizations and government agencies in his role as co-director of the Frank G. Wells Environmental Law Clinic. Sean also has published articles and worked with public agencies, industry stakeholders, and coastal advocates on legal and policy issues relating to sea level rise adaptation and the role of insurance in addressing climate change-related risks. Welcome, Sean.
Thank you. And you needed 15 minutes?
Yeah, hopefully I'll get done faster than that, but let's
Thank you.
say 15 and see where we get. Thank you, Madam Chair and Commissioners. I want to thank Dr. Metella and Madeline Cavallari and Director Ainsworth for inviting me to present today. And the focus of what I'm going to talk about will be the relationship between flood insurance and related kinds of risk management and coastal adaptation and their relationship to the commissions and local government's planning processes. So as we've heard, the coast is going to be changing a lot, but of course the coast has always been quite dynamic. And one of the things that has characterized the dynamic impacts on the coast in the past is that they have been within a range of expected values. The coast changes in ways that we have to adapt to over time, but sea level rise is going to change the coast in one direction in a pretty dramatic way outside of the historical range. And we've already heard quite a bit about this. One thing I want to emphasize also is that even small amounts of sea level rise can create significant impacts from storm surge and beach loss. I don't have a slide for this, but you probably are all familiar with the idea that if you have a beachfront that does not have a lot of slope, even a small amount of rise can create a lot of lateral rise. And beyond that, the king tide and storm surge dynamic is the most significant piece of all of this. The vulnerabilities sometimes come in the context of individual catastrophic events. We've already had about 6 to 8 inches of global sea level rise in the last 100 years, so this has already started. And one of the things that I noted in Dr. Metella's presentation is that we do have scenarios that are based on different estimates, and that's because there's quite a bit of uncertainty about the rapidity and the magnitude of sea level rise going forward. And this creates some specific challenges for risk management. It's hard for planners to know how to plan. It's also hard from a financial perspective for anybody to understand what the risks are that will materialize at a certain point in time. And this creates a lot of different types of challenges when you're thinking about infrastructure, when you're thinking about residences and commercial properties, and also public infrastructure like utilities and potential realignment of highways. And none of this, of course, is a secret to anyone in the private sector. Insurers have been thinking about this, particularly the largest global insurance companies have been not only supporting modeling, but doing a lot of work to try to understand these risks and work on them for years now. I've engaged with insurance company analysts and modelers. Folks in the military have been at the forefront of doing this type of planning. I mean, these are very conservative institutions that understand that they have to understand the risks better. And that's because the failure to understand and plan for the risks is going to be a lose-lose for everybody in the long term. So I'm here to talk a little bit about the role of insurance in all of this. As some of you might know, between the 1920s and the 1950s, most private insurers pulled out of the flood insurance market. There was a time more than 100 years ago when the typical homeowners fire insurance policies that people had included flood risk. It turned out that insurers did not find those risks to be insurable and started pulling out of insurance markets in the mid-20th century. And this is because sea level rise itself is a threat to insurability. It's a strategic risk for insurers that historically they've found themselves unable to handle. Typically, an insurable risk is a risk that will be spread over a large area where it occurs more or less randomly. It has to be a situation where there's a market for the insurance in the sense that the insurer can collect premiums that overall are adequate to cover the insured exposure to the risks, because otherwise insurers are going to become insolvent. You have to have a situation where there's a variety of different risk profiles. The one challenge in insurance markets is what's called adverse selection, the idea that only the really risky properties are going to get the insurance, and then that creates this threat to insurability because you're not spreading the risk. So you can think of a classically insurable risk as auto accidents. There are some people who are riskier drivers than others. There are some people who have more losses than others, but you have a lot of different events, and they're spread kind of randomly. If you look at the whole population, not everyone is going to have an auto accident on the same day. But if you have a storm surge, everyone in a community might suffer a loss at the same time. And that's a dynamic that creates a lot of risk to insurers. And it becomes even more challenging in a context where we have sea level rise. This was before sea level rise was a thing that these risks started to be considered uninsurable in the private market. But now, one of the other things insurers have to do is they have to be able to predict risks. They run a lot of data to figure out how likely is a fire to happen in this community, how likely is an auto accident going to happen. And if the past data and can't effectively model the future risk, insurers aren't just dealing with risk, they're dealing with a kind of uncertainty that's very challenging for them to plan for, which causes them to withdraw even more from insurance markets. And so we've had this happen in particular on the Gulf Coast. So Hurricane Andrew was really an especially important event in the insurance community where a lot of risk, which in that case was mostly wind risk, and so it was insured risk because most of the damage was ultimately from wind, the insured losses were so high that they caused insurance markets to collapse in Florida. There was not sufficient capital to cover the claims, and insurers are very, very wary now in the Gulf Coast in particular about that kind of dynamic. So we have a federal program, the National Flood Insurance Program, that stepped in the 1960s to cover a lot of these risks. And that program has a bunch of aspects to it. They map flood risk and they make determinations about where they estimate the 100-year floodplain to be, meaning one flood on average will happen every 100 years. You can imagine that under sea level rise conditions with storm surge risk changing, that what used to be a 100-year flood risk map may not any longer be the 100-year flood risk map, and FEMA's, the federal agency that runs the flood insurance program, its maps are not keeping up with the times in various ways. The federal government underwrites the insurance itself because the private market withdrew from it, and they collect premiums, but a lot of the premiums are subsidized, and in particular some of the older properties are very heavily subsidized, and this has the positive effect for homeowners of making flood insurance affordable, but it has the negative effect, of course, on the entire system, of meaning when there's a large storm event with a lot of losses, that the system effectively has to borrow money from the general federal treasury, and it's not a self-sustaining system. The program has been widely criticized over the years, but it also does have some very important features, one of which is that if you're in a 100-year map flood area, you have to have flood insurance, which is a good thing. You have to have it in order to get a mortgage. The question of whether everyone renews those policies and follows those rules over time is a different question, but having that insurance is very helpful. There's also minimum standards for land use for development in special flood hazard areas in certain communities, and so that requires local governments to update their hazard planning in a way that is quite helpful. And there's also the community rating system, which gives a premium discount to homeowners that live in communities where the communities have developed certain types of features that mitigate and minimize risk. And so all of these aspects of the program create quite positive incentives for communities to deal with flood risk. The maximum coverage under the flood insurance program is $250,000. It won't be a surprise to any of you that doesn't approach the median property values anywhere on the California coast right now. Another interesting feature, though, is that the program has to write policies in the 100-year mapped areas. It can't deny insurance. So anybody can get that $250,000 of coverage, and again, often the premiums are subsidized. I mentioned that the private flood insurance market had collapsed, but there's been a resurgence of private flood insurance in recent years. Some of this is excess insurance. People have higher property values and want to buy more insurance. They can go into a market, and usually they're paying much higher premiums for it, but there is alternative private coverage out there, even for smaller risks. And one of the reasons that this higher coverage has been, that private coverage has been developed is actually because we have more information about the risks. As the mapping gets better and as communities develop mitigation, that creates an incentive for private insurers to go back into the market. There has been concern that I've seen expressed in various public comments to the Commission recently that the opposite is true, and that understanding more about the risks will scare insurers. It actually turns out that the dynamic is almost the opposite of that, because the more there is understanding of risk and what that risk profile will be, the more insurers have confidence. They're not scared of risk. Their whole business is managing risk. They're scared of uncertainty about what those risks are. So there was a recent report that came out of the University of Pennsylvania. There's a researcher there named Carolyn Kuski, who's really the leading researcher on these issues. And she and some of her colleagues looked at the emerging private insurance market and came to some conclusions. They did a lot of work interviewing participants in the insurance industry and insurance markets and land use professionals and local governments, and concluded a few things. One of which is that because the flood insurance program is there, private insurance can really only substitute if it provides broader or different coverage than what the flood insurance program provides. Different companies have different strategies. It's interesting that some companies actually have a business model where they're looking at lower flood risk communities and saying, well, your risk is going to increase and it'd be valuable for you to buy insurance from us because the premiums will be low. There are other companies that actually have a strategy of looking at high-risk communities and pricing their policies higher. But again, the more information there is about those community risks, the more likely it is that private insurers will come in. Another thing they found, which is not a surprise, is that a lot of people in areas that are vulnerable do not have flood insurance, either through the flood insurance program or otherwise. And there's a lot of well-studied reasons for the lack of demand for flood insurance. Some of it is lack of information. Some of it is optimism, kind of a head in the sand idea that most of us have. You know, when we think about our properties, we don't want to think about worst-case scenarios. And there's a lot of evidence in the behavioral psychology and behavioral economics academic literature that shows that we tend as people to discount very high magnitude, very low probability or far in the future risks. We discount that to zero in our mind. We don't think about those risks over time. And so on the whole, we are underinsured in those areas. But they also found that flood risk is really directly, that the losses are correlated in part with underinvestment in public infrastructure and obsolete building codes and ineffective land use planning. Insurers are more interested in insuring, and communities are safer where planning actually plans for the risks, which isn't a surprise, I'm sure, to anyone on the commission or staff here, but it's counterintuitive to many people on the coast who would rather wait. It turns out that waiting and not planning is generally not a good strategy. So what does this mean overall for and I'll say one other thing, which is that there was evidence that they found just by interviewing folks in the insurance industry that more aggressive land use management and building codes and those kinds of things actually enabled more private flood insurance to be written overall in communities that had them. So again, this research wasn't comprehensive, it wasn't entirely California-based, but it provides some strong evidence there. So what does this mean? I'll just recap. Availability of private flood insurance has been a problem for a century almost. Most flood insurance is still provided by the national program, and most people don't take advantage of it, even if they can. The national program will write a policy for anyone in a participating community, and that is the standard, meaning that nothing that the commission or local governments do is going to affect availability or rates of insurance in that direct way. What affects the availability of insurance is the program's operation and the mapping of the flood zones. And again, private insurance availability is significantly improving over time as we develop more information about risks and as communities are working actively to manage these risks. The flood program insurance is still standard for mortgage lenders in these 100-year floodplain zones, and they have to accept it. And more, they're also accepting private insurance. It's interesting that the standard is the federal program, and they have to, in some cases, to be convinced to accept private insurance. But as private insurance is becoming a little bit more of a thing, that has been easier to do. So bottom line, property values are more likely to be affected by other market dynamics, and insurance plays an important role and will be an increasingly important factor. And more information and planning over time will be good for communities as they start to engage more with private insurance markets. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really helpful. Should we just move on? Or? Okay. Keep it short.
Well, I mean, I just appreciate I don't want to take much time, but I appreciate that we're getting into these issues with regards to sea level rise. But I would say that if we were Sandpiper or Gobi, we wouldn't really be talking about it in these terms, because we have estuarine systems that are at risk too. And all we keep talking about is houses and bridges and roads. And these estuarine systems, humans can move up the hill, but these systems cannot. And I would like to make sure that as we analyze these and we're moving forward and having these presentations, that we're really taking into account these fragile systems that are also at risk. And that's all I have to say.
Commissioner Wilson,
I have more to say about that, but we don't have a lot of time.
and we are focusing on those issues around habitat migration inland with sea level rise and how that affects those systems. Really important. A really important point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ainsworth. Thanks to staff. Thank you, Commissioner. I'm informed that Ms. Sackett indicates she submitted a slip that we may not have. But Ms. Sackett, come forward, state your name again for the record.
Hi, Mandy Sackett with the Surfrider Foundation. I just have a few quick updates in the Orange County area that are timely, and I just wanted to bring it to your attention. I know we're constrained on time. So I've got a PowerPoint. Someone might have walked away with the clicker, so I'll just say next slide. So thank you for this presentation today. We appreciate these monthly updates. Excited for the opportunity to discuss and explore sea level rise issues each month. And so I'll start just here in South Orange County. Oops, wrong presentation. I've got 4 today. So our South Orange County beaches are really suffering from erosion, which seems to have been exacerbated over the past few years. I have a photo here of San Onofre State Beach, which is actually technically San Diego County, Camp Pendleton property. In 2017, State Parks put in an emergency revetment, 800 feet of rocks, to protect a public access road to the beach, and the commission earlier this year authorized it for 5 more years. Now the erosion is really terrible at the rest of the beach, is in dire need of a plan. We really hope State Parks will develop a plan that uses alternative methods to protect the beach and parking south of the seawall. We're working with Parks and Coastal Conservancy staff to apply for funding for a living shoreline project down there. In the meantime, my ask is just please don't put any rocks on the beach or let Parks put any more rocks on the beach. We're working hard to find a solution. Moving up coast, you saw some photos of Capistrano Beach. We appreciate this time Coastal Commission staff did not allow Orange County Parks to place boulders on the beach to protect the bike path. Instead, they're using geotextile bags and coming up with a long-term plan. And just a note, we do have some concerns with the geotextile bags. They really fall apart. This is the south end of Capistrano Beach. They're, just should be a temporary emergency option rather than, basically a de facto seawall. So a long-term plan really should be finalized and required in any of these types of emergency permits. And then just moving along the coast, this photo is just to highlight the situation up north in Newport and Huntington is very different. The beaches are much wider, but the adjacent communities, as you heard, are very low-lying, extremely vulnerable to sea level rise, especially with associated groundwater rise. The groundwater table there is just super high. So here's Huntington Beach. We really carefully consider, we're hoping that you will all really carefully consider any new development that goes in, especially major costly infrastructure projects. You heard yesterday about the proposed Huntington Beach desalination plant during public comment. That would be sited here next to the AES power plant. The orange arrow shows where the plant would go. The issue here is that the site will experience an island effect with only 2 feet of sea level rise, allowing this project to be sited so close to the coast and in such a low elevation area will saddle local officials, local taxpayers with unneeded headaches, unneeded expenses over the coming decades. So I hope you'll really take that into consideration. And so just to wrap up, I do really appreciate the commission and staff's efforts to administer LCP grants and work to plan for these issues. In the meantime, there's a number of projects that could result in decades of impact and momentum towards armoring. So I'm just hoping the commission will make wise decisions moving forward. Ultimately, if you all don't save our beaches, who will? So thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Ms. Sackett. Matt Caparito, Realtors Coastal Commission Issues Group. Mr. Schmidt, are you both speaking together, or are you speaking for both?
No, we're going to introduce him. No, I'm not Matt.
All right, thank you, sir.
Morning, commissioners. Yeah, still morning. My name is Don Schmitz. I am here on behalf of the Realtors Coastal Commission Issues Group. You're going to probably be hearing and seeing a lot of them going forward in the future. They are a group of organizations from Mexico up to the Oregon border, and they have retained me to advise them on Coastal Commission matters, especially as it pertains to sea level rise. And I asked them when we first started having conversations, what was the purpose of the organization? They want to constructively engage and help. And we've had good meetings. I've told them that the sea level rise is a very important issue. We have state laws pertaining to this. All the local coastal programs are going to have to be updated.
Mr. Schmidt, let me interrupt you. I apologize. As I understand, you were going to introduce the next speaker who had 3, or did you want 3 minutes each?
3 minutes each, please.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, sir. And the clock kept running. It's all right. I'll talk faster. So that's the goal and intention of this organization. They're going to interface with the local governments, the cities and the counties. They're already talking to some of the cities in the County of Orange in regards to the presentation here today. They want to be very involved with your staff. And it's a real opportunity because nobody knows these communities better than the local realtors do. They also bring a lot of expertise in regards to the issue of disclosures. We made a presentation to the County of Ventura Monday of this week, who is going through their LCPA with a grant from the Coastal Commission, and they are going to be sitting on a task force with the county to work on the disclosures for property owners on what the planning issues are as they pertain to sea level rise. So with that, and with probably a great deal of glee from the chair, I'm going to wrap it up with a minute still left on the clock, and I'd like to introduce our president. Thank you.
Okay. And do you need more time too?
I am going to speak faster than the $6 million man. How's
Loving
that?
it. Love it.
Good morning, Matt Caprito. I'm commissioners and staff. I'm a realtor and past president of an association in Ventura County, Realtor Association. I'm here to speak as president of a coalition of 29 realtor associations who are engaged in the local coastal programs, as well as the sea level rise plans, and how that affects private property rights throughout the state and here in Orange County. As realtors, we know our communities. We're the trusted advisors. We are the people that are counted on in our communities. We're also concerned about the environment for my kids and grandkids as well as yours. As far as the options are, that are out there, your options, there are multiple options, multiple solutions. It's not necessarily, this is not a one-size-fits-all type of approach. We know this, that it's likely that these reports will mandate real estate disclosures for properties. We're the experts. We are counted on within our communities up and down the state. That also includes the impact on financing, on insurance, and title insurance. So let me speak, and not to counter what the past speaker said, but I'll use the Thomas Fire as an example, and the floods and fires in Santa Barbara. Insurance companies are pulling out. There's no enthusiasm to let's dig in and help. It's a real problem, and it's a problem today with properties that cannot close because of insurance. I do not believe, speaking as an individual, as a realtor in our communities, that it's going to encourage insurance companies to stay in the marketplace. That's a real concern right now. We should have a seat at the table. We do want to be part of the solution, specifically when it comes to the disclosure issues. Look, we coach our sellers throughout the process on a day in and day out basis. We have to understand what to disclose in order to disclose it. That's why we need to be at the table. Buyers that come in from these areas and think the coast is the coup de grace of their life, they don't have a clue. They need us to understand and to disclose environmental concerns, what's next, and the conditions that could be posed into the future. We're the experts. You can count on us. We're here to be part of the solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. I think we're moving along. Do I have any more speaker slips?